The first morning of peace came not with celebration, but with silence. The kind of silence that follows after years of constant noise, the whistling of bombs, the thunder of artillery, the screams that had become as common as birdsong. In Berlin, 1945, silence itself was foreign, suspicious, like a stranger appearing suddenly at the door. The dust had not yet settled, literally and figuratively, as it coated the remnants of what had once been a proud city. Now it was little more than a skeleton picked clean by the vultures of war. Between the mountains of rubble that had once been apartment buildings, museums, schools and shops, people emerged slowly, cautiously, like animals unsure if the hunter had truly gone or was merely waiting. Their faces were gaunt, eyes hollow, movements mechanical, the movements of people who had forgotten what it meant to live rather than merely survive. Among them walked a solitary figure, tall and angular, with wild grey hair that seemed to have a life of its own, moving in the gentle breeze as he navigated his way through the ruins of the once imperial city. Josef Steinmann had once been a respected professor of engineering at the University of Berlin. Now he was just another old man, indistinguishable from the countless others who wandered the rubble-strewn streets, searching for lost relatives, lost homes, lost memories. But unlike the others, who searched with their eyes cast downward, Joseph looked up and around, his keen gaze taking in the destruction with a clinical detachment that might have seemed callous to an observer. In truth, his mind was already racing ahead, not dwelling on what was lost but calculating what could be salvaged, repurposed, reborn. Even before the final surrender had been signed, before the last Nazi flag had been torn down and burned, Joseph had begun sketching plans in a worn leather notebook he kept tucked in the inside pocket of his threadbare jacket. The other survivors in his bunker had watched him with a mixture of curiosity and concern as his pencil moved frantically across the pages, his lips moving silently as if in conversation with someone only he could see. They had whispered among themselves, "The old professor has finally lost his mind. The bombings have driven him crazy." Joseph had heard them, of course. The concrete confines of the bunker carried whispers like shouts, but he had not cared. Let them think what they wanted. He had work to do. The notebook had been a gift from his wife Elsa on his 60th birthday, 5 years before the war began. She had passed away in the winter of 1943, not from bombs or bullets but from pneumonia, worsened by the cold of their unheated apartment and the scarcity of medicine. Joseph had mourned her quietly, privately, as was his way. In the days after her death, he had buried himself in his work at the university, continuing to teach engineering principles to the ever-dwindling number of students, mostly boys too young or physically unfit for military service. But as the bombing campaigns intensified and the university buildings were damaged or requisitioned for military purposes, formal education had gradually ground to a halt. Joseph had found himself with nothing to do, no purpose to fulfill, at precisely the moment when purposelessness was most dangerous, when sitting alone with one's thoughts meant confronting losses too painful to bear. The notebook, with its blank pages waiting to be filled, had saved him then, giving him a place to record his ideas, to plan for a future that seemed increasingly unlikely to arrive. Today, 3 weeks after the official end of hostilities in Europe, Joseph made his way to what remained of the university's engineering building. Most of the structure was gone, but the basement laboratories had survived relatively intact, protected by the reinforced concrete that had been installed during the early years of the war as an air raid shelter. The American soldiers who guarded the area knew him by now. The strange old man who appeared every morning at precisely 8 o'clock nodded politely and disappeared into the ruins. At first, they had followed him, suspicious of his intentions, but after watching him salvage bits of machinery, wires and tools, they had decided he was harmless. One of them, a young lieutenant from Boston who had studied engineering himself before the war, had even developed a grudging respect for the old German, occasionally bringing him small mechanical parts that he thought might be useful. The lieutenant never asked what Joseph was building, and Joseph never volunteered the information. Some things were better left unspoken in these early days, when trust was as fragile as the damaged buildings that lined the streets. The young lieutenant, Michael Johnson was his name, though Joseph had never used it, preferring the formal distance of lieutenant, reminded Joseph of his own son Thomas. There was a physical resemblance, certainly, both tall and lean, with a certain intensity in their gaze, but it was more the way Johnson approached problems, with a combination of meticulous attention to detail and intuitive leaps of understanding, that brought Thomas to mind. Thomas had been brilliant, perhaps more so than Joseph himself, with a particular gift for visualizing complex mechanical systems in their entirety, seeing how each component affected the others. He would have made an extraordinary engineer had he lived, but Thomas had died in 1942, not in combat as so many sons had, but in a Gestapo cell, arrested for his involvement with a student resistance group that had distributed anti-Nazi leaflets on campus. Joseph had never learned exactly what had happened to him there. The official notification had said only heart failure, but he had heard enough stories, whispered accounts of interrogation methods, to fill the gaps with nightmares. Inside the laboratory, Joseph carefully laid out his findings for the day. 3 undamaged vacuum tubes, a spool of copper wire, a small electric motor salvaged from a destroyed Messerschmitt aircraft, and most precious of all, a nearly intact radio receiver that he had found in the rubble of a former SS headquarters. The Americans had stripped the building of anything they deemed valuable or sensitive, but they had overlooked this particular piece of equipment, perhaps because its casing was so badly damaged that it appeared beyond repair. But Joseph knew better. The inner workings were what mattered, and those were largely intact. His gnarled arthritic fingers, once capable of the most delicate adjustments to precision instruments, now struggled with the smaller components. But he worked patiently, methodically, as he had done throughout his 40-year career. The laboratory had become something of a sanctuary for Joseph. Here, among the tools and materials of his profession, he could almost forget the devastation above. The familiar smells of machine oil and heated metal, the precise movements required for delicate assembly work, the pure logic of engineering principles, these things had remained constant, even as the world outside had descended into madness. In his younger days, Joseph had been known for his absolute dedication to rational thought, his unwavering belief that any problem, no matter how complex, could be solved through the rigorous application of scientific principles. It was an approach that had served him well in his academic career, earning him a reputation as one of Germany's foremost engineering minds, but it had also made him slow to recognize the irrational forces that had taken hold of his country. By the time he had understood the true nature of the Nazi regime, it had been too late. For Germany, for Thomas, for the millions whose lives had been consumed by the inferno of hatred and violence. Outside, Berlin was beginning the long, painful process of clearing away the mountains of rubble. The Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women, formed human chains, passing bricks hand to hand, separating those that could be reused from those that were beyond salvage. The work was backbreaking, the progress agonizingly slow, but it was necessary. Before anything new could be built, the old had to be cleared away. Joseph understood this principle well. It was fundamental to engineering. Sometimes to create something new, you had to break down the existing structure to its component parts. This was what he was doing in his laboratory, breaking down the technologies of war into their basic elements, then reconfiguring them for a different purpose. What that purpose was, he kept to himself, partly out of habit. Years of living under a regime where independent thought was dangerous had taught him caution, and partly because he knew how it would sound if he tried to explain. They already thought him crazy. Why provide them with further evidence? Joseph had watched the Trümmerfrauen from the window of his makeshift laboratory many times. Most were middle-aged or elderly women, their husbands, sons and brothers dead or imprisoned, working to rebuild a city that had tried to conquer the world and failed catastrophically. There was a particular woman Joseph had noticed, perhaps in her 50s, with a face lined by hardship, but eyes that remained alert and determined. He worked methodically, without complaint or rest, organizing the other women in her section of the rubble field with quiet authority. One day she had looked up and caught Joseph watching. Instead of turning away, she had held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded, a simple acknowledgement of shared purpose. They were both trying to salvage something from the ruins. She, the physical materials for rebuilding, he, the technological knowledge that might otherwise be lost. Since then, they had exchanged that same nod whenever their eyes met, a silent communication between survivors. The truth was, Joseph himself wasn't entirely sure what he was creating. The idea had come to him during the final days of the war, as he huddled in the bunker, listening to the constant bombardment above. The vibrations had traveled through the earth and concrete, making the very air around them tremor. Something about those vibrations had triggered a memory from his youth, his father's farm in Bavaria, the well that had gone dry one summer, and the old dowser who had come with his forked willow branch, walking the fields until the stick had bent downward, pointing to the hidden water beneath the surface. Joseph had dismissed it as superstition at the time, embarking instead on his life of science and reason. But now, with the world around him reduced to chaos and rubble, he found himself returning to more primal forms of knowledge. What if there was a way to combine the dowser's intuition with modern technology? What if he could create a device that could locate, not water, but the pockets of air where survivors might be trapped under collapsed buildings? The dowser had been an old man named Adalbert, with weather-beaten skin and eyes as blue as the Bavarian sky. Young Joseph, not yet 10 years old, had followed him across the fields, watching skeptically as the forked stick twisted in the old man's gnarled hands. "It's not me making it move, boy," Adalbert had said, noticing Joseph's doubt. "It's the water calling to the wood. They remember each other, you see." Joseph hadn't understood then, had filed away the experience as a curious relic of superstition that science would eventually replace. But decades later, huddled in the darkness while death reigned from above, he had thought again of Adalbert's words. What if there was a kind of memory in the physical world, connections between things that science had not yet fully explained? Every day, Joseph heard the same heartbreaking scenes play out across the ruined city, families digging frantically through rubble with bare, bleeding hands, calling out names that received no answer, rescue workers forced to make impossible decisions about where to focus their limited resources, the muffled cries of the buried gradually fading into silence. The traditional methods of locating survivors, listening devices, trained dogs, were in woefully short supply, and time was always the enemy. After 48 hours trapped beneath the rubble, the chances of survival dropped dramatically. Joseph's device, if it worked as he envisioned, could detect the subtle differences in density caused by air pockets, could distinguish between the solid mass of rubble and the void where a human being might still be breathing. It was theoretical, unproven, perhaps impossible, but it was hope. And hope was a commodity in desperately short supply in Berlin in the summer of 1945. Just the day before, Joseph had witnessed a particularly harrowing rescue attempt. A 6-story apartment building on Alexanderplatz had collapsed after a delayed action bomb, dropped weeks earlier, but only now detonating, had exploded in its foundation. The building had pancaked floor upon floor, creating a dense mound of concrete, wood, and twisted metal. But a woman standing nearby insisted that her 2 children had been playing in an inner courtyard just before the collapse. The rescue team had worked through the night, digging where the courtyard was believed to have been, but by morning they had found nothing. The woman refused to leave, her voice growing hoarse from calling her children's names, her hands bloody from trying to move debris too heavy for her to lift. As the sun rose higher and the day grew hotter, the rescue coordinator had made the brutal decision to move on to another site where there was a higher probability of finding survivors. The woman had collapsed then, not physically but inwardly, her body remaining upright, while something essential within her seemed to crumple. Joseph had turned away, unable to bear witness to her despair, but the image had stayed with him, fueling his determination. As summer turned to autumn, Joseph's device began to take shape. He had constructed a handheld unit that emitted low-frequency sound waves and then analyzed the patterns of their reflection. The principle was similar to the sonar used in submarines, but adapted for use in solid mediums rather than water. The technical challenges had been enormous, and there had been many moments when Joseph had been tempted to abandon the project as a fool's errand. But each morning, as he walked through the streets of Berlin and saw the ongoing search efforts, the desperation on the faces of those still hoping to find loved ones alive, he would return to his laboratory with renewed determination. The device would work. It had to work. The breakthrough had come from an unexpected direction. Joseph had been struggling with the problem of distinguishing between different types of solid materials, concrete, wood, metal, each of which reflected sound waves differently. Without a baseline for comparison, the readings from his device were nearly impossible to interpret. Then one evening as he walked home, he had passed a group of children playing in the ruins. They had created a game of sorts, tapping on pieces of debris with sticks and listening to the different sounds produced. Joseph had stopped to watch, and as he did, something had clicked in his mind. The children weren't analyzing the sounds intellectually. They were responding to them intuitively, recognizing patterns without conscious thought. What if his device could be calibrated to do the same? The first real test came in October, when a partially cleared building on Unter den Linden suddenly collapsed, trapping a dozen workers beneath a fresh mountain of debris. Joseph heard the news from his American lieutenant, who had continued to bring him mechanical odds and ends throughout the summer and fall. "Thought you might want to know," the lieutenant said casually, not meeting Joseph's eyes. "Happened about an hour ago. They're saying there's not much hope." Joseph understood what was being offered. Not just information, but an opportunity. The lieutenant had noticed what Joseph was building, had perhaps guessed its purpose, and was now providing a chance to prove its worth. Joseph nodded once, tucked his device into a canvas bag, and followed the lieutenant through the ruined streets to the site of the collapse. The day was cold, with a biting wind that carried the first hint of the harsh winter to come. As Joseph and the lieutenant approached the site, they could see the cloud of dust still hanging in the air, illuminated by the weak autumn sunlight, like a ghostly reminder of the building that had stood there just hours before. The dust coated everything and everyone, the rescue workers, the bystanders, the military vehicles that had been brought in to assist with the heavy lifting. It turned the scene monochromatic, as if they were walking into an old photograph where all color had been leached away, leaving only gradations of gray. Joseph felt the dust settling on his skin, in his lungs, a physical manifestation of the weight of what he was about to attempt. His device, still untested outside the controlled environment of his laboratory, would now be put to use in a situation where lives quite literally hung in the balance. The scene was one of controlled chaos. German civilians and American soldiers worked side by side, removing debris piece by piece, while medics stood by, ready to treat any survivors who might be found. A German engineer was directing the effort, consulting hastily drawn plans of the original building to identify potential survival spaces. Joseph approached him cautiously, aware of how he must appear, an old man in worn clothing, carrying a strange contraption cobbled together from salvaged parts. The engineer barely glanced at him before turning back to his plans. "We have no time for scavengers here," he said dismissively. "Clear the area." It was the American lieutenant who intervened. "Sir," he said, addressing his superior officer who was overseeing the operation, "this man is Professor Josef Steinmann, formerly of the University of Berlin. He's developed a device that might be able to locate survivors." The American officer looked skeptical, but was pragmatic enough to recognize that they had little to lose. "5 minutes," he said to Joseph. "Show us what your device can do, and then clear out if it doesn't work." Joseph nodded, opened his canvas bag, and withdrew the device. It was an ungainly thing, with an array of repurposed parts visible through its partially exposed casing, wires running to a pair of headphones that Joseph placed over his ears. The spectators, soldiers, civilians, rescue workers, watched with expressions ranging from curiosity to open derision as Joseph began to move slowly across the rubble field, sweeping the device back and forth like a metal detector. For several long minutes there was nothing. Joseph's face remained impassive as he listened through the headphones, but inwardly he was beginning to despair. Had all his calculations been wrong? Had he wasted months on a useless contraption when he could have been helping with the physical work of reconstruction? Then, faintly, he heard it. A rhythmic variation in the reflected sound waves, too regular to be anything but man-made. A heartbeat perhaps, or the tapping of someone trying to signal their location. Joseph stopped, adjusted some settings on the device, and listened again. Yes, there was definitely something. He looked up at the circle of doubtful faces surrounding him and pointed downward. "Here," he said simply. "Dig here." The engineer consulted his plans and shook his head. "That's not possible." According to the building's layout, that area would have been completely crushed. There's no survival space there. Joseph said nothing, simply continued to point. It was the American officer who broke the impasse. "Dig," he ordered, and the soldiers and civilians set to work, removing the debris from the spot Joseph had indicated. They dug for 20 minutes, finding nothing but more rubble, and Joseph could feel the weight of their growing skepticism. Then, one of the German workers called out. He had uncovered a small void, and from within it came a faint sound, a human voice, calling weakly for help. The energy at the site transformed instantly. More workers rushed to carefully expand the opening, and within an hour they had extracted a young woman, miraculously alive despite a broken arm and severe dehydration. She had been trapped in a space so small that she could barely move, created by the fortuitous arrangement of fallen beams. It was not a space that would have been predicted by analyzing the building's structural plans. Only Joseph's device, detecting the subtle difference in density, had been able to locate it. As the medics carried the young woman away on a stretcher, the American officer looked at Joseph with newfound respect. "Keep looking," he said. By the end of the day, Joseph's device had located 3 more survivors, all of whom would certainly have perished had the rescue effort continued according to conventional methods. Word spread quickly through the ravaged city. There was a machine that could find people buried under rubble, a machine created by the old professor who everyone had dismissed as crazy. Suddenly, Joseph found himself in demand. American and British officers wanted his device for their sectors of the city. German officials who had once been his colleagues but had distanced themselves during the Nazi years now claimed long-standing friendships. Even the Russians, suspicious of everything produced in the western sectors, sent representatives to observe the device in action. The change in how he was perceived was both vindicating and discomforting. For years, Joseph had been accustomed to a certain invisibility, first as an aging professor whose best work was presumed to be behind him, then as a political suspect under the Nazi regime due to his refusal to join the party, and finally as just another old man wandering the ruins of a defeated city. Now suddenly people were looking at him, really seeing him, and he wasn't entirely sure how to respond to the attention. There was a part of him that wanted to retreat back into obscurity, to continue his work in peace, without the complications that recognition brought. But he also recognized the responsibility that came with his invention. If it could save lives, he had a moral obligation to ensure it was used as widely and effectively as possible. Joseph met these overtures with the same quiet reserve he had maintained throughout his life. He was not interested in recognition or in the politics of occupation. He wanted only for his invention to be used to save lives. He agreed to demonstrate the device to anyone who asked, to explain its principles to anyone who could understand them, and to help build more units using whatever materials could be salvaged from the ruins of Berlin. He asked for nothing in return except that the devices be made freely available wherever they were needed, not just in the sectors controlled by one occupying power or another. Throughout the winter of 1945-46, Joseph's life settled into a new routine. Each morning, he would visit a different part of the city where buildings were being cleared or where new collapses had occurred. He would operate his device, now nicknamed the Steinmann Finder by the American soldiers, locating survivors where traditional methods had failed. Each afternoon, he would return to his laboratory, making refinements to the design, training others to operate the devices, and supervising the construction of additional units. He ate little, slept less, driven by a sense of purpose that had been absent from his life for many years. The work sustained him, gave him reason to continue in a world where so many others had lost hope. The winter was brutal, one of the coldest in memory, as if nature itself was delivering a final punishment to a continent that had already suffered so much. The Berliners called it the hunger winter, due to the severe food shortages, but it might just as well have been called the despair winter, for the toll it took on already fragile spirits. The city, still in ruins, offered little shelter from the bitter cold. Joseph worked through blizzards, his hands so numb that he could barely adjust the controls of his device, his breath freezing in his beard as he moved methodically across snow-covered rubble fields. There were days when the batteries for the device froze and had to be warmed against his body before they would function. But still, he continued, driven by the knowledge that each hour he worked might mean another life saved. In February 1946, Joseph was called to Munich, where a series of buildings had collapsed following heavy snowfall. The journey was difficult, the transportation system was still in disarray, and Joseph was now 73 years old, his body beginning to protest the demands he placed upon it. But he went without hesitation, carrying his latest version of the device, now smaller and more sensitive than the original prototype. In Munich, he worked for 3 days without rest, locating 17 survivors who were pulled alive from the ruins. On the 4th day, as he was demonstrating the device to a group of engineers who wished to build similar units for use in other German cities, Joseph collapsed. He awoke in a field hospital established by the American forces. A doctor, a young woman with tired eyes and a kind smile, informed him that he had suffered a heart attack, not severe but a warning that he could not continue to drive himself so relentlessly. Joseph listened to her advice, nodded as if in agreement, and within an hour of her leaving his bedside was making plans to return to Berlin. There was still too much work to be done, too many who might yet be saved by his device. His own life, in comparison, seemed a small thing, but when he attempted to rise from his bed, he found he lacked the strength. For the first time, Joseph was forced to confront his own mortality, not as an abstract concept, but as an imminent reality. He thought of all he had not yet accomplished, the refinements to the device that existed only in his mind, the training he had not yet provided to enough operators, the plans for more advanced versions that might locate not just open spaces, but human heartbeats directly. Would all of this die with him? Would his knowledge, painfully acquired through decades of study and recent months of urgent experimentation, be lost? As Joseph lay in the hospital bed, his thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a visitor. the American lieutenant who had first brought him to the collapsed building in Berlin. The young man, Johnson was his name, had been transferred to Munich in January, but had heard of Joseph's presence in the city and his subsequent collapse. "Professor," he said, settling into a chair beside the bed, "the doctors tell me you're planning to discharge yourself." Joseph nodded. There was no point in denying it. "I have work to finish," he said simply. Lieutenant Johnson looked at the old man for a long moment. "Professor," he said finally, "do you know how many lives your device has saved so far?" Joseph shook his head. He had not kept count. Each life had been important, but he had been focused always on the next search, the next improvement to the design. "Over 300, Johnson said, "just in Berlin and Munich, and that's not counting the ones in Hamburg, where they built a version based on your design, or in Frankfurt, where they're using it to check buildings before demolition to make sure no squatters are inside." He paused, letting the information sink in. "That's why I'm here, actually. My commanding officer wants to know if you'd be willing to write down how the device works in detail. We'd like to send the specifications to other cities, maybe even back to the States for earthquake zones. But no one really understands how you've made it work so well." The number 300 echoed in Joseph's mind. 300 people who would have died without his device. 300 families spared the grief that had become so common in these post-war years. It was a number both larger and smaller than he had expected. Larger in that he had never anticipated his improvised invention would save so many. Smaller in that it was still just a fraction of those who had perished in the war, a drop in the ocean of loss that had engulfed Europe. But it was not insignificant. Each life represented a future that might otherwise have been extinguished, possibilities that would have gone unrealized. Joseph considered the request. He had been protective of the device, not out of a desire for recognition, but from a fear that in the wrong hands it might be repurposed for less humanitarian aims. Even now, with the war over, the world was an uncertain place. The Americans and Russians were already eyeing each other with suspicion across the divided landscape of Europe, but Lieutenant Johnson had proven trustworthy, and the need was great. "I will need paper," Joseph said finally, "and time. There is much to explain." For the next 2 weeks, as his strength slowly returned, Joseph dictated the principles of the device to Lieutenant Johnson, who took careful notes and occasionally brought in other engineers to clarify technical points. Joseph held nothing back, explaining not just how the current version worked, but his ideas for future improvements. He drew diagrams with a hand that still trembled slightly from his illness, described the mathematical formulas that had guided his design, and emphasized the importance of proper calibration for different types of debris. Throughout, he insisted that the knowledge be shared freely, not patented or restricted. "This was born from destruction," he told Johnson. "Let it serve only to preserve life." By the time Joseph was strong enough to return to Berlin, copies of his technical specifications were already being distributed to engineering teams throughout Germany and beyond. The Steinmann Finder, as it continued to be known despite Joseph's protestations that it should have no name at all, became an essential tool in the reconstruction efforts that would continue for years to come. As the mountains of rubble were gradually cleared and new buildings rose from the ruins, the device found fewer trapped survivors, but was repurposed for other life-saving applications, locating people buried by avalanches in the Alps, finding miners trapped after collapses, and, as Johnson had predicted, helping rescue workers after earthquakes around the world. Joseph himself returned to a quieter life. He continued to refine his device and to train others in its use, but he no longer pushed himself to the point of physical collapse. He watched as Berlin slowly transformed, as the stark geography of destruction gave way to the tentative architecture of renewal. The visible scars of war gradually faded, though the invisible ones remained, in the nightmares of survivors, in the gaps in families where loved ones had once been, in the collective memory of a nation coming to terms with its own culpability in the catastrophe that had engulfed the world. In 1950, Joseph received a letter from the newly established Federal Republic of Germany, inviting him to Bonn to receive a commendation for his contribution to the reconstruction efforts. He declined politely but firmly. He had never sought recognition, and he had no desire to stand before officials and cameras, many of whom had been silent during the years when speaking truth had been most necessary. Instead, he continued his quiet work in Berlin, now focused on teaching a new generation of engineers at the reopened university. His classes were always full, students drawn not just by his technical expertise, but by the moral authority he had acquired, a man who, when faced with destruction, had chosen to create, when surrounded by death, had dedicated himself to preserving life. Joseph lived to see Berlin begin to prosper again, though the division of the city between East and West saddened him deeply. He had always viewed his work as transcending political boundaries, and it gave him some comfort that his device was used on both sides of the increasingly fortified border that ran through the heart of the once unified city. In the spring of 1956, at the age of 83, Josef Steinmann died peacefully in his sleep in the small apartment he had occupied since the end of the war. The funeral was small, attended primarily by former students and colleagues, but news of his death prompted commemorations from rescue services around the world. In the decades that followed, as technology advanced and more sophisticated equipment was developed, the basic principles of the Steinmann finder remained in use, incorporated into new devices that continued to locate people trapped beneath collapsed buildings, buried in avalanches, or lost in other disasters. Perhaps the most fitting memorial came many years later, when an earthquake struck Mexico City in 1985. Among the international rescue teams that rushed to the scene was a German unit equipped with the latest version of acoustic detection equipment, a direct descendant of Joseph's original device. During their work, they located and helped rescue a group of infants trapped in the ruins of a collapsed hospital nursery. One of the German rescuers, upon learning that the parents of one of the saved children were searching for a name for their newborn son, suggested Joseph. When asked why, he told the story of the old professor who, amidst the ruins of Berlin 40 years earlier, had built a machine from salvaged parts that had gone on to save thousands of lives around the world. The parents agreed that it was a fitting name for a child who had been granted a future against overwhelming odds. In the end, that was Josef Steinmann's true legacy, not just the lives he had saved directly, but those who would be saved in years to come by the continuation of his work. In the silence that had followed the thunder of war, when others saw only destruction, he had seen possibility. When they called him crazy, he had continued his solitary work, driven by the simple belief that every life buried beneath the rubble was worth saving. And in that belief, he had created something that transcended the destruction from which it was born, something that gave voice to the buried and hope to those who searched. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments of human history, there remained the capacity for innovation driven